The new NAR settlement requires two things. First, buyer agent commissions can't be posted on the multiple listing service anymore. Sellers can still pay for the buyer agent, but listing agents can't advertise it on the MLS. And second, agents need to have a signed buyer agency agreement before they show a home to a buyer. And that buyer agent agreement has to state exactly what the buyer will be paying the buyer agent. It can't state something vague, such as whatever the seller is willing to pay. And that's it. But those two things will force both buyers and sellers to really sit down and discuss who's paying what and how much. Before agreeing to pay a buyer agent tens of thousands of dollars, it's smart to know exactly what you're agreeing to. But it's not easy. The 8-page agreement is written in legalese. I think that buyers will be shocked at what's actually hidden inside all those words. I'll go over some of the details that you're not going to hear from anyone else. And if you bring some of these points up to an agent, they probably won't believe you, but it's all right there, hidden in plain sight. I'm going to give you the truth and the details you need to know before you sign. First, you need to know how commissions have been paid. In the past, buyers were just told that the seller pays for all commissions, so you don't have to really worry about it. But now there are more choices, and some sellers might not want to tell you up front whether or not they're willing to pay a buyer's agent. I created some diagrams here to try to show you how the money is paid and who pays what in a normal transaction. First of all, well, let's say a $700,000 home, a seller agrees with the listing agent to, let's say, pay them 6%. And this has always been negotiable, but let's just use common numbers. The seller is paying 6% to the listing agent. And then the list, how it's been most of the time is the listing agent then agrees to share half of that or 3% with the buyer's agent. And they put the listing in the multiple listing service, and that way, a buyer agent knows up front before they show a home, hey, this listing agent is paying a 3% commission. And the buyer has nothing to do with the amount that is being paid to the buyer's agent. Now, what if a buyer doesn't want a buyer agent? And I've talked with some, a bunch of them over the years. They say, hey, I want to go directly to the listing agent. I don't need no stinking buyer agent. I can find the home myself. I can negotiate. I'm a smart buyer. So instead of the listing agent giving a buyer agent 3%. Let's cut out the buyer agent, and I want the listing agent to give me the 3%. Or they want the seller to reduce the price by 3%. But unfortunately, the seller already has a listing agreement with the listing agent saying that they're going to pay them 6%. If there's no other buyer agent, the listing agent doesn't have to share that. So they get to keep the 6%. So buyers get totally upset about that. And then they say, well, if I'm not going to be saving any money, I might as well use a buyer's agent. So the smart ones would usually do a little Google search, and they'd search for agent offering buyer rebate. And they'd probably find my site, which I agree to give buyers half my commission as a rebate. So the seller agrees to pay 6% to the listing agent. The listing agent lists in the MLS, and they give me 3%. And me and the buyer have an agreement where I will rebate them 1.5%. And it's totally legal, at least in Georgia. Some states they don't allow that sort of rebate, but in Georgia they do. So that way the buyer can save some money. They use that 1.5% rebate to go toward their closing costs, so they don't have to bring as much cash to the closing table. So that's one way they can do it. Now, Instead of the seller paying 6% to the listing agent, they are now giving the seller the option to split that up themselves, where they can agree to pay the listing agent 3% and agree to pay the buyer agent 3% directly. So it's not the listing agent sharing their commission. So now, if there's no buyer agent, then the seller saves that 3%. They save $21,000. So they'll net out, instead of 658, they'll net out 679 because they're only paying the listing agent a 3%. But what I've seen is a lot of times listing agents will, in their agreement with the seller up front, say, hey, if there's no buyer's agent, I want to be paid 4 or 5% because I'm going to have to do more work because there's not another buyer agent taking care of this buyer. I'm going to have to do a lot of extra things. So sometimes it's not really saving anyone a full 3%. Um, so in this situation where the seller is paying both agents, then you can still use me as your buyer's agent, where if I receive that 3% from the seller, I'm going to still have an agreement with the buyer to rebate them half of that. So they get a 1.5% rebate and I keep the other 1.5%. And that way the buyer saves that money, and then the seller still pays both commissions and nets out the 658. So that's a way to get the buyers some savings in there. So I guess the main point that the settlement is trying to accomplish is they want to get the seller to negotiate with the listing agent what their fee is going to be. And they want the buyer to be able to negotiate with the buyer agent. They don't want the seller to be preemptively saying what the buyer agent fee is going to be. Because what if that buyer doesn't want a full service agent? What if they just want a limited service agent, just maybe to write up the contracts? Um, so if you have the seller agreeing up front, then you'd have to do something like I said, do a buyer rebate. But they want it to eventually settle out where the buyer and buyer agent agree up front who's what the fee buyer agent fee is going to be. But a lot of times buyers don't have 3%, like on a $700,000 home, that's $21,000 more that a buyer would be on the hook for at closing. They're already doing the down payment and the closing costs for the loan. So how can they agree to $21,000? That's a lot of money. What they can do is they can still negotiate with their buyer agent, and whatever that is, let's say they negotiate with me and we agree to 1.5% as a buyer agent. Then they can make an offer in the seller where they ask for not the seller to pay the buyer agent, but they ask the seller for a certain amount of closing costs. So they can ask the seller for 3% closing costs. And then from that 3%, they can give 1.5% to the buyer agent and then use the other 1.5% for lender closing fees and such closing costs. So that's the way I think it's eventually going to filter out to eventually be. And so it's going to be kind of semantics. You won't call it buyer agent compensation, but you'll probably get more sellers just paying a higher amount of buyer closing costs. And that's on the standard forms. This is the standard purchase and sale agreement. So you always had purchase price and then the seller contribution at closing toward closing costs. And in this form, the definition of closing costs here is shall include without limitation any compensation obligations of the buyer. So compensation obligations of the buyer is the buyer agent commission. So that's defined as just an ordinary closing costs that the seller can pay part of if you just work it in there. And even now there's a lot of contracts where buyers can't afford to pay all their lender closing costs, so you just work it into the price and the seller paid contributions to closing. So in the past, a buyer agent always knew what the seller was going to pay because they could just look at the listing sheet and where the agent posted, say, at 3% to the buyer's agent. But now it can't be listed in the MLS. But that's really not a huge deal because now um, the buyer agent just has to call the listing agent before showing a home so they know what is being offered. Is the listing agent sharing their commission as it's always been? Or is the seller paying the commission to the buyer agent? Or is the seller open to paying a certain amount toward closing costs? You really need to know that so you know how to structure the offer. But let's step back a second. Thinking like a buyer, I'd want to know why I shouldn't just call the listing agent to show me the home and then let the listing agent fill out the contract with the numbers that I want to offer. You might be thinking that you're pretty smart and you did all the work of finding the home yourself. Why do you even need a buyer's agent? It's a great question. So I've worked with a lot of very smart buyers, doctors, lawyers, PhD scientists. It always surprises me about how little they know about homes and the process of buying a home. Now, it's not rocket science, but if you're only doing it once every 10 or 20 years, it's tough to know everything you need to know. And the process is different from state to state. It's like most things. It looks pretty easy until you get into the details. And maybe 80% of the time things go really smoothly. But what about the 20% of the time when there's a bump in the road? Are you ready to deal with the situations that might come up? Do you know enough about the process to be able to avoid bad things from happening? You'll have a skilled listing agent who might know the contract inside out against yourself, who is learning as they go. Do you want to take a risk on such a big financial transaction? Here are the main items I would consider when deciding whether or not to work with a buyer's agent. One of the biggest risks I see for a buyer who goes directly to a listing agent is the listing agent will be holding the earnest money. Many don't really think it matters much, but like they say, it doesn't really matter until it really matters. Read the contract very closely when it comes to the powers of the holder of the earnest money. You really want to uh, understand page 3, number 7, earnest money, all this stuff about the earnest money. And you will see here, holder may disperse the earnest money upon a reasonable interpretation of the agreement. Now, how crystal clear is that? The question is, what's a reasonable interpretation? Well, the other thing down here is all parties hereby covenant and agree to not sue the holder for any decision of holder to disperse earnest money in accordance with this agreement. So you're agreeing in this contract that the holder of the earnest money can disperse it upon a reasonable interpretation. And if you don't agree with that, you really can't sue the holder. So do you trust the listing agent to disperse it correctly? Well, I've seen disbursements that I didn't agree with at all. So now you might think, well, Tim, let's have the closing attorney hold the earnest money. That might sound good, but in practice, a lot of closing attorneys don't want to get involved with holding the earnest money. And if they do, if there's any sort of disagreement with how funds are dispersed in case of a default, then 9 times out of 10, the closing attorney is just going to do letter C here, interpleader. So they will just If an earnest money dispute cannot be resolved after a reasonable time, holder may interplead the earnest money into a court of competent jurisdiction. Then the prevailing defendant and the interpleader shall be entitled to collect the attorney fees, court costs, and any costs that the holder of the earnest money might have. So that's what's going to happen most of the time if the closing attorney holds it. And that might be okay if you have a real clear cut case, but it's going to tie up that earnest money. And if you're trying to move on to a next home and use that money with the next transaction, it could be tied up for who knows how long. So anyway, if it were me, I think that's one of the biggest values that a buyer agent comes is that the buyer agent broker will hold it and they will be the one who makes a reasonable interpretation of the agreement. There's no guarantee that my broker is always going to um, favor the buyer, but if there's any gray area, they're going to probably give it back to the buyer. The next item I think is keeping track of the important dates of the contingencies. Now, if you just have the listing agent, are they really going to care whether or not you, the buyer, keep your contingencies and keep all the deadlines if it's not in their seller's best interest? They'll want you to screw up because then they always have the possibility of at least getting the earnest money for the seller. So you better really understand the 9-page purchase and sale agreement and all the exhibits and amendments. You can't make an excuse that you didn't understand something. If you're 1 minute late on a contingency deadline, it's as bad as being a day or two late. Maybe the listing agent will tell you to just send it over in the morning, even though the due diligence ends at midnight. Then in the morning, they'll tell you that it's too late to ask for any repairs since the due diligence ended at midnight. And if you now want to terminate, you will lose your earnest money. And you would also be liable to pay the total commissions to them too. And I'll go over that in a minute. The only thing that matters in real estate is what's written. Verbal agreements are worthless. The other thing that I think a buyer's agent brings to the table is negotiations. What terms are customary? What terms are going to be competitive in a multiple offer scenario? Do you want to lose offer after offer, learning as you go until you finally get an offer accepted? I love to negotiate. Many people don't like it or are pretty bad at it. That alone could cost you thousands of dollars. Other thing that I would be concerned about is the inspections. Do you really know enough about homes to know what things are deal breakers and what things aren't really a big deal? Now, many inspectors are worried about covering their butt. They're going to send you a report that's going to make small issues sound like it's the end of the world. You'll end up terminating deals unnecessarily because you didn't know any better and didn't have anyone to guide you through the process and helping you ask the right questions so you can make the right decisions. And if you ever read an inspection report, you'll understand. It's good that the inspectors write it so it sounds so bad because it helps you negotiate with the seller better. But I've seen so many buyers get freaked out and scared off a totally perfect or a good home with some minor defects, but the inspection report made them sound like they were deal breakers and they just passed on a home that they should have bought. Other thing that a buyer's agent can do is help you shop for a mortgage. I love to help you analyze mortgage quotes to figure out which is the best deal. Many times it's really confusing. You end up paying much more than you have to. If you save a 0.5% in the interest rate, that could be worth over $30,000 over 15 years. Other thing about saving money, I can help you pick a low cost closing attorney. Total closing attorney fees vary from $600 to $1,300. Few, if any, agents shop around for the best deals. They use someone who is convenient to them or a company that's affiliated with their brokerage. I shopped around and created a spreadsheet with the total fees from 38 closing attorneys. Three of the good, very good ones are under $700. That alone will save you about $500. If you choose to work with the buyer's agent, the next thing you should do is study the standard buyer agency agreement in detail. So let me go over the new exclusive buyer brokerage engagement agreement. This is the one that I have buyers sign with me. First, buyer agrees to pay buyer's broker the compensation set forth below at the closing of any contract to purchase. And here is an important point here, as that term is hereinafter defined. And I'll go over that in a second. But I charge 1.5% of the sales price. And then here, it's kind of confusing. And I don't agree with this conforming to the NAR settlement agreement, but this is the form that the Association of Realtors came out with. Here it says, buyer hereby approves buyer's broker receiving compensation from seller or seller's broker with the maximum amount the buyer's broker may receive from seller or seller's broker is as follows. I just put a high number here, 10%, but then I write in here any amount above 1.5% that you agreed up here will be rebated to the buyer. Now, no other buyer agent is going to offer that there. So somehow they're going to put probably 3% here, and they'll probably have 3% there. So and it says right here, any compensation buyer's broker receives from seller or seller's broker shall, and you have these three options: reduce the compensation buyer shall pay to the buyer's broker dollar for dollar. So I think that's what most agreements are going to end up being, but just make sure it's not this one. It shall not reduce the compensation buyer shall pay buyer's broker. So this is saying if seller is paying a buyer broker and you have this second one checked, it shall not reduce your obligation up here to pay the buyer broker yourself. So you could be end up still having to pay what you agree there, and then the agent can still be getting what the seller is offering. So make sure that number two is not checked. That's very, very important there. So anyway, so one thing I don't agree with here is in the agreement, the settlement agreement, the buyer broker shall not receive anything from anyone else, the seller or seller's broker, more than what they agreed with the buyer to pay. So I don't know how they can agree to, say, 1% here and then have 3% or 6% down here and get paid more than what they agreed to here. So that's a little gray there. So I don't want to be involved with that. So that's why I say I'm getting 1.5%. Anything above that will be rebated to the buyer. Now let's go here. There's three things that I would want specified in special stipulations to change this standard buyer brokerage engagement agreement. First of all, what is the contract to purchase where you're responsible for paying a commission, as that term is hereinafter defined? Well, you really have to search for that where I searched at first. I search and search and search, and where is that definition of the definition of contract to purchase? So in this here, B2 term and extension, like most people don't even read this here, but if during the term of this agreement, buyer and a prospective seller enter into a real estate purchase and sale agreement, and then they go and or an option to purchase or an exchange of real property or a partnership. So all those things basically enter into a real estate purchase and sale agreement, hereinafter collectively contract to purchase. So this is where they're defining what contract to purchase is, that a buyer would be responsible for paying a commission to the buyer broker. So look here, it says into a real estate purchase and sale agreement. It doesn't say a residential real estate purchase and sale agreement. So what if it's a commercial property? It doesn't say where the real estate purchase and sale agreement is. What if you're buying a condo on the beach in California? If you sign this during that time, you buy a condo in California, you would owe the buyer broker in Atlanta a commission on that agreement. Right there it says. Now, the other thing that's the craziest thing, and you're not going to believe me, but I'll show you. And most agents have never even read this, even though it's right here in the agreement, is what is the definition of the buyer? Now, right here on page 5 of 8 on clause F, they actually have definition of buyer and seller. So most people just skip over there. Of course, I know what the buyer is. I know what the seller is. It's probably the person who signed the darn agreement, right? Well, let's read. For the purpose of determining whether buyer has purchased real property herein, thus triggering buyer's obligation to pay the compensation, the term buyer shall include buyer, all members of buyer's immediate family. Think of that, about that. What is immediate family? Well, you can go to Black's Law Dictionary. They're the go to source for the definitions of legal meanings. So, their definition of immediate family is the term used to describe your parents, wife, husband, children, and brothers and sisters. So it's just not you and your wife, it's or husband, it's your children, it's your brothers and sisters, it's your parents. So think about that. Like an example I give people is Donald Trump. I don't know, he has a brother. I don't know what his brother's name. Say it's Jim. And Jim Trump works with me as his buyer's broker to help him find a home and buy a home in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, while he's under this buyer agency agreement with me, if a member of his immediate family, let's say his brother Donald, purchases a commercial office building, a $10 million scraper in Manhattan, that is a contract to purchase, a real estate purchase by an immediate member of Jim's family. Jim could be on the hook to pay me a commission on Donald's purchase of that skyscraper in Manhattan. Now that's nuts. So, but that's what it says there if you just go by the meaning and the words in the contract. So that's why I make sure I wouldn't sign something like that as is. So that's why I go down here and in the special stipulations in my agreements, I say the definition of buyer shall simply be the persons or persons who sign this agreement, usually the husband and wife. And the only real estate purchase covered by this agreement shall be for single family residential properties in the metro Atlanta area. If you buy a condo down in Panama City while you're under this agreement, I'm not going to get a commission for that. And then the other thing that's very important is if the buyer needs to default on a purchase and sale agreement, broker shall not pursue them for a commission. What most buyers do not realize when they sign this buyer agency agreement is they might be on the hook to pay the commissions for both agents, even if they don't purchase a property. They think that the downside risk at most is the earnest money. But on page 6 of 8, number 8, buyer default, and it says buyer agrees to immediately pay broker its compensation in the event any of the following occur. And one of them is buyer defaults under a contract to purchase real estate under which buyer would have been paid in which broker would have been paid its compensation had the transaction closed. So let's say, like, here's a perfect example. You get under contract closing in a month. And a week before closing, you get laid off. You lose your job. Now you don't qualify for the loan. Well, your financing contingency might have ran out after 2 weeks. And now you're not covered by any contingency, but you can't get the loan, you can't buy. Well, tough luck. You're not only going to lose your earnest money because that's a default, you're going to be on the hook for the 6% commissions to the agents. So on a $700,000 home, the earnest money and the $42,000 in commissions you would be liable for. Or say, like another thing, say, a week before closing, you get a job transfer to California that you just can't turn down. So you default on the contract, you would be liable for all those commissions and the earnest money. Or say your mother gets sick and you got to go to move to California to take care of your sick mother or sister or brother or whatever, you would have to default and you would be on the hook for the commissions and the earnest money. So I think that's a big deal to be aware of. So that's why I say that I'm not going to go after you for the commission, even though, and that doesn't happen very often, but as a listing agent, recently I had a listing that went under contract 3 days before the closing. This buyer decided they weren't going to buy the home anymore. They didn't give any good reason. They just said, we're not going to buy it. So I try to hold their feet to the fire. As a listing agent, I want to get it sold for my seller. So I said, hey, if you don't buy this, if you just default like that, I'm going to come after you for commission, which was going to be $10,000. They decided that they still weren't going to go through with the transaction. So I went after them and we settled. Well, I didn't take them to court, but I just told them I was going to go after them for the $10,000. So we agreed to a compromise where they paid me $7,000 in lieu of the full 10% and in lieu of me taking them to court. So it does happen. And, if I'm the listing agent, I will go after the buyer. But when I'm the buyer's agent here, I'm not going to go, I'm going to say, put it in writing, I'm not going to go after you. So the other thing that you want to be aware of is this C here, just so you understand, you're agreeing that um, buyer acknowledges and agrees that broker shall owe no duties to buyer nor have any authority on behalf of buyer other than what is set forth in this agreement. Okay, so that's what is the CYA for the buyer agent. It's like the only thing that is covered is what's in this agreement. There's no other side verbal agreements at all. It's only what I state in this agreement here that we sign. So what are the broker's duties to buyer? Might be a lot less than you maybe anticipated. It's here to make all disclosures required by law. Okay, that's a no-brainer. Comply with all applicable laws. Okay, that's nothing really. B, attempt to locate property suitable to buyer for purchase. Most of the time, buyers are finding the homes themselves and um, identifying them. So that isn't a big deal for a buyer broker. So basically, what the buyer broker is agreeing to is D, assist to the extent requested by buyer in negotiating the terms of and filling out pre-printed real estate purchase and sale agreement. That's it. There's nothing else in here. And then they go out of their way to list in number B here. It says that all these list of all these things here, anything basically that you could have found out about with all sorts of inspections or structural engineers, environmental engineer, government official, any of that. It's up to you to don't rely on whatever the agent says because the agent is not an expert in any of that. Buyers should seek independent expert advice regarding any matter of concern relative to the property and this agreement. Give a lot of advice in here. I can't help myself here, but just know when you're signing this this is the agent covering themselves that they told you to seek independent expert advice, which I think is very, very important. And even here it says, again, buyer acknowledges and agrees that broker shall not be responsible for ensuring that buyer complies with the duties and deadlines contained in any purchase agreement entered into buyer, and that if buyer shall be solely responsible for the same. So even writing special stipulations, if you have your broker write up a special stipulation, you're stating that you understand what that means, and if the broker screwed up in not protecting you the right way, the broker is not liable. So anyway, you're not really protected that much in here, but the agent is protected. That's what these agreements are mostly for. So one of the thing that you'll have buyer agents and listing agents come up and show you 105 more ways agents who are realtors are worth every penny of their compensation. So they'll go in here page after page of all these things that a buyer agent does. And then a listing agent, they have one that 179 ways of why a listing agent is worth every penny that they get paid. And that's great, but it doesn't really matter unless an agent is willing to attach these lists to the buyer agent agreement. Otherwise, like you said, like you saw in there, only what's in this buyer agent agreement is what counts and what they're responsible. So they can say anything that they want, but they will never include that into the buyer agency agreement because they want to uh, cover themselves. They don't want you coming back and saying, "Hey, you didn't do number 57, so you're in default," or something like that. So, I understand that. But what I do, I add these special stipulations to my buyer agency agreement. So it's kind of a checklist that I have. I add a list of special stipulations to my buyer agency agreement here. And it's 28 items here. And they're pretty, some of them are common, but not all agents do all these things. And I want a checklist to keep me accountable. So at the end of the transaction, we're going to go through here, check these all off. And at the bottom here, I say, if we check all that off, I want a buyer to commit to submitting a review for me on Zillow and Google. So if I do all these things that I agreed to do, I want you to write me a nice review on Zillow and Google. I don't think that's much asking very much. And then the other thing I have for the buyer and me, buyer and buyer agent shall be on time for all appointments. That's very important to me. When we're looking at homes, if I set up a tour of 5 or 10 homes, it's important not to start 25 minutes late because I have everything planned out. And then there's sellers changing their life to accommodate us. So be on time. I know life happens and traffic happens, but it's very important that we have an understanding up front that you're going to really, really, really try to be on time for all appointments. But these things I have here is just some of them. I'm going to show you as many homes as needed. I'm going to tell you, point out the negatives along with the positives if you request. I'm not going to stick my 2 cents where it's not wanted. But if you want my opinion and ask for it, I'm going to tell you the good, the bad, the ugly. Important items in the purchase and sale agreement, just like I've been going over here. Explain escalation clauses, appraisal shortfall contingency, appraisal contingency. We're going to submit as many offers as requested. Sometimes it takes 5 or 10 offers in a competitive market to get one that's accepted. Yeah, if you want to pay 10% over list price, it's easy, but you want to be competitive, but you don't want to overpay. So sometimes it takes a while to get one accepted. And I'm going to help you give you a CMA, AVM, and past appreciation analysis and the current market condition report. I'm going to contact the listing agent for background and details about seller and seller situations so we can draft good terms that are good for the seller and good for you. Um, Help you determine the appropriate offer price and terms, create a floor plan and total square feet measurements with my Cubicasa app so we don't have to guess about how big the home actually is. I'm going to help you save money with my spreadsheet of 38 closing attorneys with their fees. Same thing with lenders, inspectors. I'm going to help you compare mortgages so you can save as much money there. Um, give you a list of all the important dates for the transaction. Make sure you're aware of what needs to be done by what time. I'm going to be there for all inspections and ask appropriate questions. I'm going to help you select the repairs to be requested, help you estimate the cost of anticipated repairs. I have some really good resources for that. I'm going to make myself available with reasonable notice to let you in to see the home, to meet contractors, take measurements or other necessary visits. Um, Help analyze if the appraisal comes in low, help you analyze that, whether it's just a bad appraisal or whether we need to negotiate for a lower price, help you with the utility information, a list of low cost natural gas suppliers. I'm going to be there with you in the final walkthrough. I'm going to be there with you at the closing. I'm going to help you with apply for the homestead exemption for the property tax. And here I have the buyer shall coordinate with buyer agent when scheduling inspections so the buyer agent can attend. So I just request that before you set up the inspection time, let me know so I can make sure I have time in my schedule to be there during the inspection. So anyway, those are the things that I bring to the table and I will make those part of the agreement and be accountable for them. So after you decide to hire a buyer's agent, the next question is which one? I would shop around, talk with at least three. Hopefully I'm one of them. I want to interview for the job. This is pretty much my job interview right here. I would look at their experience and their reviews. I've been in the business, I've been a full-time real estate agent since 1999, and I have a lot of good Zillow and Google reviews. And then the other thing that, most agents aren't even aware of this, but I would have an agent show you their key activity report. Now, when an agent goes into home, they pull up their super E key and they get into the lockbox. So there's a report that an agent can run that shows every lockbox that they entered over the up to 6 months. So they probably won't know there's such a thing, but let me just show you really quickly so you could kind of so there's a key activity report that an agent can run. And here I did this, it went back 6 months, and here it shows 147 records. So I've entered 147 lock boxes over the past 6 months. So that comes out, I think, is about 6 homes per week, which usually that's a little low for me. Usually I do about 10. So if an agent pulls this up and over 6 months, they're averaging just showing one or two homes a week, or maybe just a handful of homes per month, that isn't a very active agent. And are they really in tuned with what's going on in the market? Are they previewing homes? If you're a full time agent, if you're not showing a buyer, you should at least being in your designated area of expertise, you should be previewing new listings as they come on the market. And if you're showing probably more than 20, 30, 40 homes a week, that's a lot of homes. So you're going to be very busy. So if an agent is so busy, are they going to really have enough time to work with another buyer? So I think the sweet spot is somewhere between 6 and 15 homes per week is usually probably pretty good. So anyway, that's a real nice, easy tool. But like I said, most agents won't even be aware of that. But trust me, it's there. I just showed it to you, and that's a real simple way to know how how active they are. There's nothing wrong. Well, uh, some say there's nothing wrong with a part-time agent. Some part-time agents might be wonderful. Maybe they, worked very, very many years and now they're just semi-retired. But I think you got to be out there. If you're going to be doing real estate, you need to be doing it every day, showing homes, negotiating contracts, knowing what's going on in the market. So so anyway, so I hope that this is basically my interview to be your buyer agent. If you find value in that, give me a call. I'd love to help you purchase your next home. It's always exciting. I always think it's like an Easter egg hunt, and I really enjoy it a lot. I love helping save buyers a lot of money and help them walk through the process step by step and explain things in detail. I think that's important. Maybe some people, hey, Tim, you're just telling me too much, too much information. But I'd rather give you too much information than not tell you everything. And then you come back and say, hey, I didn't know that. Why didn't you tell me that? So, anyway, um, I like to give you the truth and the details. If you like that, give me a call. I'd love to start working with you.